Hello, my name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a faculty member in the History Department at Drexel, where I'm also the department head. It's my pleasure to speak with you today about the history of Drexel. It's been very much on our mind in the last couple of years as we work to produce a book documenting the 125 years of history of the institution. You can see the cover of the book on the second slide in the presentation, Building Drexel, the University and its City, 1891 to 2016. We had many goals with the book, of course, first to tell the overall history of the institution, but not just that, also to talk about the ways that Philadelphia's history has been altered, changed, strengthened by Drexel, and vice versa, how Drexel has evolved as an institution in the Philadelphia urban region. And that is a really interesting relationship between the two that sometimes institutional history leaves out. So if we look at the third slide, I want to set the stage here a little bit to talk about how the Drexel Institute of Art, Science, and Industry actually came about. And we have to begin the story with Francis Martin Drexel. Francis Martin Drexel was born in Austria. He was educated as a painter, and he ran away from home, basically fleeing being impressed into Napoleon's army. He made his way to Philadelphia, and he came to Philadelphia at a time when the city's growth was very robust. As you can see here, Philadelphia, as it was sometimes called in those days, was the Athens of America. It was a very rapidly growing city, had a strong economic base. It was the trading capital of the Eastern Seaboard, and Drexel arrived in Philadelphia at a time when there actually was a pretty good market for what he could do, which is to paint portraits. You see here a self-portrait of Francis Martin Drexel and his young family, and he decided he would become a portrait painter. He made an okay living at that, but not enough to really support his growing family. And so he made his way actually to Central and South America, where he took up painting portraits. And he was doing that kind of work all the way up until the 1830s, when he decided that it would be a good idea to change professions. Some people believe it's because of the information he got spending time with wealthy aristocrats and painting their portraits. Found out a little bit about currency speculating, which he was involved in. In 1837, he opened the Drexel Bank. And the timing of that is very important because the Second National Bank of the United States had just folded, and the United States was moving into a long era of private banking, and the Drexel Bank was founded at just that moment. The timing really couldn't have been any better. If you move to the fourth slide, you'll see the population growth of Philadelphia after the Civil War. The Drexel Bank was very much involved in discounting private banknotes and currency speculation, but also as a sort of investment bank in this very rapid period of industrialization for the United States. And so the population is growing up to the time of the Civil War. The Drexel Bank was so important to the American economy that, in fact, they lent money to the federal treasury during the Civil War, and it was the Drexel Bank that lent its good name to the issuance of war bonds during the Civil War. By this time, Francis Drexel had 6 children, and one of his 3 sons, Anthony J. Drexel, was very interested actually in the family business. He really apparently loved being in the bank. He worked in the bank as a young man. Although he never took a college degree, his education was gained basically at the banking counter of the Drexel Bank in this very rapid period of economic growth for Philadelphia and for the nation. And when his father died in 1863, although he was not the only family member involved in the bank, it was really A.J. Drexel who became the central figure of the bank's progress. You can see that at the Civil War's conclusion and the nation is coming back together, it's an even more robust period of economic growth. And some of the photos we see on the fourth slide of the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition in 1876, or the new Drexel Bank, which was built in 1885, give a sense of the growth of the economy and the growth and change of Philadelphia from a merchant seaport into really an industrial metropolis. If we look at the fifth slide, we can see A.J. Drexel had to develop as a pretty young man, a philosophy of wealth, because he had come into wealth and then the wealth of the bank had grown dramatically through the Civil War years. He could have stopped working at that point and been a man of leisure. They certainly didn't live a very difficult life in terms of material wealth. They had plenty. They built a compound for the family at 39th and Walnut Streets. And yet, at the same time, we know from the little writings and what we have of his own words, A.J. Drexel really was not a person who was willing to take a lot of credit for the wealth that had come his way. As we see here, he believed that wealth comes to a man by accident. And philanthropy was important to him, and it was important to his family. If we look at the sixth slide, you can see some of the people who had a strong influence on A.J. Drexel and his thinking. George W. Childs was a newspaper editor, publisher, lifelong friend of A.J. Drexel's. St. Catherine Drexel was his niece, who very much adopted A.J. Drexel as a father figure, and she had a conversion and took up a life of service in the church, particularly trying to bring aid to Native American and African American children. And we know that this had an impact on A.J. Drexel's thinking in the later 19th century. A.J. Drexel's wife, Ellen Rosé, also had a major influence on his thinking. She was a feminist in the late 19th century, very much involved in feminist causes and very much involved in the kinds of concerns that community had in Philadelphia in those years, which would have been votes for women, but also dealing with the after effects of the end of the Civil War for African Americans, and really expanding some sort of concept of welfare, what we now would call welfare, some ability to provide for those, particularly immigrants who were in need in the city. And so these are the different forces that were working to shape A.J. Drexel's thinking as he started to look to his legacy. What would his legacy be? If we look to the seventh slide, take a look here, we know that he was already thinking about endowing an educational institution in the 1870s, and he was thinking about this through into the 1880s. There's documentation that he was considering that to be a women's college. But Bryn Mawr College opened around that time, and so perhaps that need in the Philadelphia area was met. He was deeply impressed by some of the models of education that were coming out of Europe in those years. Deviating from the normal patterns of university education, we see some really interesting innovation in higher education in Europe in these years, as well as in the United States, uniquely fitted to the needs of the industrial workplace. University education was really a preserve of a very small number of elites in the 19th century. But, of course, there was an enormous growing demand for industrial expertise. The engineering disciplines were just coming into their own at this time. There were very few schools of engineering at that time. And there was a large need for some education of those who perhaps were immigrants, had come into the industrial workforce, and were trying to work their way into supervisory roles or more expert roles. And so we see places like the Technical University of Berlin or the Manchester Mechanics Institute. And in the 1890s, we get the founding of schools like Carnegie Tech, the Armour Institute of Technology, which is now the Illinois Institute of Technology. Carnegie is now Carnegie Mellon University. And we get the founding of the Drexel Institute at exactly this moment. And so he was deeply influenced by all of these different impulses, trying to give back to his city, trying to help to develop the industrial workforce, willingness to innovate away from the normal patterns of university education, and trying to basically meet the social need that was felt very deeply in Philadelphia and other industrial cities at the time, a concern perhaps that there would be a permanent urban immigrant working class that could not find their way up the social ladder. And of course, moving up that social ladder was a central promise of American democracy. And so we can see A.J. Drexel's thinking in all of these very different and interesting ways going into the founding of Drexel Institute. If we turn to the 8th slide, we'll begin to think about where it was he wanted to put his institute. Could have put it anywhere. I think the location choice is really an interesting and telling one because, although we might not know it today, the spot where the Drexel main building was placed, 32nd Street and Chestnut Street, was actually in the center of one of the most heavily industrialized spaces in the world at that time. In fact, right across the street from the Drexel main building was W.C. Allison's Junction Car Works, one of the largest rail car manufacturers in the world. Just a block away, Croft and Allen's chocolate factory, of course, adding some good smells to the neighborhood, but a major industrial employer, and just a few blocks away from the Pennsylvania Railroad's major West Philadelphia station and rail yards. The largest slaughterhouse on the East Coast was also located right in this place, so we can imagine the different sounds and smells and activity of the area. We know that A.J. Drexel was, in fact, a great walker, and he would leave his house at 39th Street every day and walk into the bank in Center City. And so he knew this area well. He was well acquainted with the hustle and bustle of it, and this is exactly the place that he chose to put his institute, and I think that's also very telling. If we look at the ninth slide, we can see Hollis Godfrey, who was the second president of Drexel, looking back and really trying to put into some context what it was that A.J. Drexel thought he was doing, providing students with very specific kinds of educational tools they needed to rise in the industrial professions that most of them were in. If we turn to the 10th slide, we can see some of the architectural features of the main building. A.J. Drexel gave $3 million to endow the university. He did not live very long to enjoy the success that the Institute would have in its early years. He died just after its founding. And yet, the legacy lives on. Even in the way that the building looks, we can see this commitment to trying to bring together the erudition of a sort of European approach, a neoclassical approach, with the technological sort of cutting edge of its time. This is a building with a library and a museum, but also laboratory spaces as well. The interior of the building, designed by the Wilson brothers, who designed a lot of train stations, is an interesting one. If you walk into the great court of the Drexel main building, you may sometimes feel that you're in the middle of a train station, and that, of course, reflects their influence of the Wilson brothers, and yet it has all of these neoclassical Italianate features as well. A very interesting building, really one of its kind. Moving to the 11th slide, we can also see some of the early images from the Drexel Institute, where secretarial training, but also art training, domestic economy, and the beginnings of a technical education that would, by the 19-teens, become the Drexel engineering education. In the 12th slide, we see an early photograph from what we now would call an engineering lab at Drexel. And as we move to the 13th slide, again returning to Hollis Godfrey, James McAllister had established the Institute on a very firm and interesting curricular pathway. But engineering education was not yet established at Drexel until Hollis Godfrey came in as the second president. Historian Tiago Saraiva has written very interestingly about Godfrey's background. He was trained by the efficiency expert Frederick Taylor. He served the government, as we move to the 14th slide, he served the government during World War I, actually helping to understand and plan for wartime logistics. And he was very impressed in those years, actually, by what he saw as a mismatch between the university and college sector and the needs of government and the needs of industry. And how would he meet this need? Well, Godfrey came up with an idea for a cooperative education model, which actually went into effect in 1919, in which students would come to Drexel and they would have their major, usually a technical or business major, and then they would go out away from the Institute and spend some time working and then come back. This model holds today, and in fact it's, most would say, the centerpiece of a Drexel education. Interesting to point out, it was not there at the beginning of the Drexel Institute's model of education, but it shows Drexel's capacity for reinvention. As we move to the 15th slide and move forward in time a bit to the World War II era and just after World War II, we see another reinvention underway. with enormous amounts of federal money pouring into all colleges and universities, but particularly engineering colleges and universities. After World War II, Drexel was the beneficiary of this growth. The classrooms were packed after World War II, and Drexel was really one of the regional powerhouses in engineering and business education. It was under the leadership of James Crease that the Institute started to look to expand its footprint. There was construction of many buildings in the 1950s, and then under the presidency of William W. Haggerty, starting in the 1960s, Drexel began a transition from a technical institute into a university, which in 1970 it became. Drexel University, which had already changed its name in the 1930s to the Drexel Institute of Technology, had now become a university. We see in the pages of the university's newspaper, The Triangle, in these years, in the 1960s, Drexel was not immune to the broader concerns and changes sweeping the United States, those having to do particularly with the war in Vietnam, with race relations, with urban renewal. Drexel University was in the center of all of these debates and concerns. One might say it has always been sort of a conservative institution in the sense that it serves large engineering and business firms, and yet the Drexel campus was very much alive in the 1960s, as it is today, with the discussions of the role of technology in society, the role of engineers in a democracy, and the role of diversity. What is the university's responsibility to its neighbors, and what are the responsibilities of universities more broadly to the cities in which they are located? If we look through the images in slides 17 and 18, we'll see some of those issues playing out. Looking at slide 19, we begin to think about the transition that the university would start to go through once again by the 1990s. And to set the stage for that, we have to look at Philadelphia's changing economy from the 1960s forward. Although in 1960 it probably wasn't too evident to people, still with a population over 2 million and a very robust industrial economy. In fact, the city was moving on its way to becoming a deindustrialized economy. Engineering, construction, mass manufacturing, these industries, although they still have an important role in Philadelphia today, were moving to a position of less dominance in those years. Those jobs were moving south, west, and eventually overseas. And these population numbers from 1960 to 2010 really tell the tale. Drexel's student population hit a peak in the 1980s, early 1980s, timed right around actually the unveiling of the requirement of the Apple computer for all Drexel students. That was a very exciting moment in the early 1980s. And yet by the early 1990s, the pressures of the urban economy, the changing urban economy, were very much being felt at Drexel. Student enrollment was in a free fall in those years. The campus infrastructure was in very bad shape. Two less than successful presidencies opened up the possibility, in fact, that the university might cease to exist. And I know that sounds a little bit existentially dramatic, but it certainly was the case when Drexel alumnus and engineering firm founder Chuck Pannoni came in as interim president. When Pannoni came in as interim president, he was tasked first by the board, actually, with considering other universities taking over Drexel. Pannoni gives his statement in a very interesting way, saying that he was not going to do that. And in fact, he just undertook a year sort of basic management to try to get the buildings that were closed in an appropriate way, to deal with labor issues that the university had, to try to focus on the positives of the institution, and to search for a new president. If we turn to the 20th slide, we can see Constantine Papadakis, who came in to the institution in 1995 as the president, and he came in with a very, very ambitious agenda. Really, in some ways, Papadakis' goal was to fulfill what Haggerty had started, a complete transition from an institute into a university, which meant a real focus on research, cutting-edge technology, as well as adding professional schools. And the 21st slide and the 22nd slide give us some sense of what Papadakis set out to do: the acquisition of a medical school, a college of nursing and health professions, a public health school, a law school, a biomedical engineering college, and many, many more programs, and the deepening of the capacity of the university through hiring new faculty who were research active, from the humanities to the social sciences, in computing, engineering, and across the professional disciplines. Drexel was transformed in those years. And Papadakis also was quite good at telling a story about the importance of the Drexel Co-op in a rapidly changing economy. And so we see yet another reinvention from the Institute to the Institute of Technology, and now to Drexel University, I think in a fully formed mode. Papadakis died, unfortunately, as now President John Frey said, in mid-stride, and left some anxiety in the institution as to whether or not we could continue forward with the same kind of momentum that we had. Turning to the 23rd slide, now we engage almost the present, and another reinvention that Drexel University is in the middle of right now at this very exciting moment. President Frey came in 2010, and he brought a new challenge to the university community. Harkening back to history, he asked a really profound question: whether or not A.J. Drexel would be satisfied with his institute, with this institution, whether or not it was fulfilling what it could do as an urban institution when we look at the condition of the neighborhoods surrounding Drexel University. That's a really difficult question, and it raises some of the many issues that were the founding impulses of the Institute in the first place. And so by asking this question, Frey had opened the way to a conversation in the university about how the university could engage not only its local community, but also could do so in the midst of the globalizing of our economy, the globalizing of technology. How could we remain local and yet have a global vision as well? And this has been a central focus of Drexel University ever since President Frey arrived in 2010. Today, as we turn to the 24th slide, I can tell you that we are in the very midst of this reinvention. Drexel University's campus has changed quite a bit in the last few years, and if you look at some of the images of the Schuylkill Yards project, for example, and the development of the new square in front of the 30th Street Station, some of that old land that was so important to the industrialized city of the late 19th century is now being reimagined, and Drexel is right there at the table as that important work is taking place. At the same time, Drexel has been instrumental in partnering with neighborhood institutions to help create a promise zone, which will enable economic activity which was not enabled up to that point. This allows local businesses and community development organizations, nonprofit organizations, to apply for funds, to take the initiative, and to help innovate this local economy. And so this is the vision moving forward as we move to the 25th slide, and I'll conclude now with a call for your own story and telling you that the only reason we were able to put together this book and to tell this story that I've just told you in too quick of a time, but hopefully you'll get a chance to look at the book and read in more depth. The only way we've been able to do that is to rely upon the collective memory of Drexel and the many people who've been students and faculty and staff and leaders here over the years. And so I would encourage you to get in touch with me and be part of our Drexel Alumni Oral History program and podcast. We really want to hear from you. We'd like to interview you and add your story to the broader narrative of the history of this really dynamic institution. And so with the 26th slide, I'll thank you for your attention, wishing you the very best, and please be in touch with me as we talk about the ongoing history of Drexel University.